The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees of Oakwood Heights, sending golden leaves dancing across perfectly manicured lawns. Officer James Miller drummed his fingers on his patrol car's steering wheel, his eyes scanning the streets of this upscale neighborhood where houses started at $500,000. He'd been working this beat for 3 years, and he took pride in keeping the wrong element out, as he often boasted to his fellow officers. It was a peaceful Saturday afternoon, the kind where families usually gathered for backyard barbecues and children's birthday parties. The crystal-clear sky and mild temperature had drawn many residents outdoors. Miller noticed several joggers, dog walkers, and kids on bikes, all fitting what he considered the neighborhood's usual demographic. That's when he spotted her, a small black girl, about 9 or 10 years old, walking alone on the sidewalk. She wore a purple jacket, neat jeans, and carried a bright yellow backpack with cartoon characters on it. Sarah Thompson was humming her favorite song from music class, completely unaware of the scrutiny she was under. Miller's jaw tightened. In his mind, something didn't add up. He'd never seen this child before, and he prided himself on knowing every family in his patrol area. The fact that she walked with confidence, as if she belonged there, only made him more suspicious. These people are getting bold, he muttered to himself, putting his car in drive. Sarah had just spent 2 hours at the community playground with her best friend Emma, whose mother had watched them play before Emma had to leave for her piano lesson. Now Sarah was taking the 5-minute walk home, thinking about the math homework she needed to finish and wondering if her dad would be home early enough to help her with it. The patrol car's engine sound made her turn around. She saw Officer Miller approaching slowly, following her at a crawl. Sarah's heart started beating faster, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because her father, Police Chief Marcus Thompson, had recently had the talk with her about how to behave if stopped by police, even though he hoped she'd never need to use that knowledge. Miller pulled his car alongside her, rolled down his window, and called out in what he thought was his authoritative voice. "Hey, stop right there." His hand instinctively moved to rest on his belt, near his weapon, a habit he'd developed over years of patrol work. Sarah stopped, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. She remembered her father's words. Always be polite, keep your hands visible, and stay calm. But she was just a child, and fear began to creep in despite her best efforts. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Miller demanded, stepping out of his car. His shadow fell over Sarah, making her seem even smaller than she was. The officer stood tall, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight. His face set in what he believed was professional sternness, but came across as intimidation to the young girl. I live here," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She pointed down the street, 3 houses down, the blue one with the white trim. Miller scoffed, not believing her for a second. In his years of experience, he'd heard every excuse in the book. The fact that the girl was pointing to one of the newest and most expensive houses in the neighborhood only made him more certain she was lying. He failed to notice the honor roll bumper sticker on her backpack or the house key hanging from a safety chain around her neck. Details that might have given him pause. Little did Officer Miller know, his next actions would not only change his life forever, but would also spark a chain of events that would shake the entire police department to its core. Officer Miller stepped closer to Sarah, his boots scraping against the sidewalk with each step. The sound made Sarah's stomach twist into knots. She could smell the leather from his utility belt and the faint scent of coffee on his breath as he towered over her. Her father had taught her to respect police officers, but right now, she wished she could just disappear. "Listen here," Miller said, his voice sharp enough to make Sarah flinch. "I know every family in this neighborhood, and I've never seen you before. So why don't you tell me the truth about why you're really here?" He crossed his arms, trying to look intimidating, completely ignoring the tears that were starting to form in Sarah's eyes. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door to the Thompsons, was watering her flowers when she noticed the confrontation. She immediately stopped what she was doing and pulled out her phone, her gardening gloves still half on. Something didn't feel right about how this officer was treating a child. "Sir, I'm telling the truth." Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. "My daddy is Police Chief Thompson. You can call him." She reached for her phone in her backpack's side pocket, but Miller's reaction was swift and frightening. "Don't move," he barked, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The grip of his hand was firm enough to make Sarah yelp in pain. By now, several neighbors had gathered on their porches, phones raised, recording everything. "Please," Sarah sobbed, "you're hurting me. I just want to call my daddy." But Miller wasn't listening. In his mind, he was dealing with what he called a situation, completely blind to the fact that he was manhandling a terrified 9-year-old girl. Miller reached for his handcuffs, the metal clicking ominously as he pulled them from his belt. The sound drew gasps from the growing crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved closer, her phone steady, as she captured every moment. "Officer, she's telling the truth," she called out. "That's Chief Thompson's daughter." But Miller was too far gone in his power trip to listen to reason. "Put your hands behind your back," he ordered Sarah, who was now crying openly. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her small wrists, designed for adult criminals, but now restraining a child who had done nothing wrong except walk home while being black. The crowd had grown larger, and whispers of disbelief and anger spread through the gathered neighbors. Emma's mother, who had watched Sarah at the playground earlier, came running from 2 blocks away after getting a panicked call from another neighbor. "What's the charges?" someone shouted from the crowd. Miller's face reddened as he realized he had no real answer. "Suspicious behavior and possible attempted burglary," he called back, making up charges on the spot, digging himself deeper into a hole he wouldn't be able to escape from. Sarah, despite her tears, remembered what her father had always taught her about staying strong in difficult situations. Between sobs, she recited her address, her father's name and position, and even her home phone number. But Miller dismissed every word as a clever lie, a decision he would soon regret deeply. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Parents pulled their children close, some crying themselves at the sight of such injustice. Others were already on their phones, some calling the police station directly, while others were posting the video on social media. In just moments, this quiet suburban street had become the stage for a drama that would soon explode across national headlines. What Officer Miller didn't know was that Chief Thompson was already on his way home, and the next few minutes would change everything. Chief Marcus Thompson was driving home early from his community meeting, feeling good about the progress they'd made on local youth programs. His police radio crackled with chatter, but one message made his blood run cold: a report about a disturbance on his street involving a young black girl. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as an uncomfortable feeling settled in his stomach. As he turned onto his street, the sight before him made his heart stop. A crowd had gathered, all holding phones and pointing them at something he couldn't yet see. Then he heard it, his daughter's crying. The sound cut through him like a knife. Chief Thompson pulled his car over so quickly the tires squealed against the pavement. Through the sea of concerned neighbors, he saw his precious Sarah, his baby girl, standing there in handcuffs. Her yellow backpack had fallen to the ground, the one he bought her just last week for getting straight A's. Her face was streaked with tears, and her shoulders shook with each sob. For a moment, he wasn't Police Chief Thompson anymore. He was just a father seeing his child in pain. Officer Miller was still lecturing Sarah about suspicious behavior when he noticed the crowd parting like the Red Sea. The whispers grew louder. "The chief is here. Oh, Miller's done it now. Thank God he's here." Miller felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up before he even turned around. Chief Thompson approached slowly, his footsteps measured and deliberate. He wore civilian clothes, a blue sweater and khakis, but his authority radiated from every movement. The crowd fell silent, phones still recording, waiting to see what would happen next. The only sound was Sarah's quiet sniffling. Officer Miller. Chief Thompson's voice was eerily calm, like the silence before a storm. Would you care to explain why my daughter is in handcuffs on her own street? Each word was carefully chosen, each syllable crystal clear. Miller's face drained of color so quickly he looked like he might faint. Chief Thompson. Miller stuttered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew in summer heat. I didn't know. She said she was your daughter, but I thought. His words trailed off as he realized just how badly he had messed up. Sarah looked up at her father, her voice small but steady despite her tears. Daddy, I tried to tell him. I did everything you taught me. I was polite. I didn't run. I told him where we live. The pride and pain in Chief Thompson's eyes were visible to everyone watching. The chief took one more step forward, now standing directly in front of Miller. Their height difference wasn't much, but Thompson seemed to tower over the other officer. The keys to the handcuffs, Miller. Now. His voice was still quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder. Miller fumbled with his keys, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped them. The crowd watched in complete silence as he moved to unlock Sarah's handcuffs. As soon as she was free, Sarah ran to her father, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face in his sweater. Chief Thompson held his daughter close with one arm, while keeping his eyes fixed on Miller, who had begun to sweat profusely despite the cool afternoon air. The officer opened his mouth to speak, probably to make excuses, but Thompson raised one hand to silence him. This moment, captured on dozens of phones and already spreading across social media, would become a turning point, not just for Officer Miller, who stood there looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole, but for the entire police department and community. The image of a police chief comforting his handcuffed daughter would soon become a symbol of everything wrong with racial profiling and everything that needed to change. Officer Miller stood there, his face a mixture of fear and shame as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool air, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. The crowd of neighbors had grown even larger, their phones recording every excruciating moment of his downfall. Chief Thompson, please, I can explain. Miller's voice cracked as he spoke. I was just following protocol. You see, there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area, and He stopped mid-sentence as Chief Thompson raised his hand again, the simple gesture more powerful than any shout could have been. Protocol. Chief Thompson's voice was dangerously quiet. Show me where in our protocol it says to handcuff a 9-year-old girl who's walking home from the playground. Show me where it says to ignore a child when she tells you her name, her address, and her father's position. Each question hit Miller like a physical blow, making him shrink further into himself. Sarah had stopped crying now, but she kept a tight grip on her father's sweater. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her phone still recording, and spoke up. Chief Thompson, I have the whole thing on video. He grabbed her when she tried to reach for her phone to call you. She was just trying to prove who she was. Miller's face went from red to ghostly white. I thought she was reaching for a weapon, he stammered, immediately realizing how ridiculous that sounded. A ripple of angry mutters went through the crowd. Someone in the back shouted, "A weapon?" In her frozen backpack. Chief Thompson gently moved Sarah aside, keeping one protective hand on her shoulder. Officer Miller, do you know what I was doing before I came home? He asked, his calm voice somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. I was at a community meeting, discussing ways to build trust between our department and the community. I was telling them how much progress we've made. Miller opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around desperately, but found no sympathy in the faces surrounding him. The same neighbors who usually waved and smiled at him during his patrols now stared with open disgust. And then, Thompson continued, I drive home to find you, one of my officers, handcuffing my daughter on our own street. Tell me, Miller, how many other children have you treated this way when their fathers weren't police chiefs? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Emma's mother pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. She was just at my house. Sarah and Emma were doing homework and playing. How dare you treat her like a criminal? Other neighbors joined in, sharing their own stories of seeing Sarah grow up on this street, of her helping to deliver Christmas cookies, of her lemonade stands for charity. Miller's professional demeanor had completely crumbled. "Please, Chief," he begged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have a family to support. I can't lose this job. I'll do anything. Bias training, community service, whatever you want." Tears were forming in his eyes now, but nobody moved to comfort him. Chief Thompson looked around at the gathered crowd, at their phones still recording, at his daughter's scuffed shoes and tear-stained face, at Miller's pleading expression. In that moment, everyone could see him weighing not just Miller's fate, but the larger implications of this incident. "Your badge and gun, Officer Miller," Thompson said finally, his voice firm but controlled. "You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The words fell like a judge's gavel in the suddenly silent street. Miller's hands shook so badly he could barely unfasten his gun belt. As Miller handed over his badge, a small voice spoke up. "Daddy," Sarah said, surprising everyone, "is Officer Miller going to learn from this?" Even in her trauma, she showed a wisdom beyond her years. The question seemed to hang in the air, challenging not just Miller, but the entire system he represented. The next 48 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. The video of Sarah's arrest had exploded online, reaching millions of views across social media platforms. News vans lined the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights, their satellite dishes stretching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters camped out on the sidewalks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Thompson family. Inside their blue house with white trim, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, stirring her untouched bowl of cereal. Dark circles under her eyes revealed she hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs on her wrists. Her mother, Angela Thompson, a local pediatrician, had taken time off work to stay home with her. "Baby, do you want to talk about it?" Angela asked softly, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. Sarah looked up, her usual bright smile replaced by a thoughtful frown. "Mom, remember when you and Dad told me some people might treat me differently because of how I look?" she asked. "I didn't really understand then, but now I do." The doorbell rang for what felt like the 100th time that morning. This time, it was Mrs. Rodriguez, carrying a homemade chocolate cake, Sarah's favorite. Behind her stood Emma and 5 other kids from the neighborhood, all holding handmade cards. "We're having a protest," announced Emma proudly, showing off her sign that read, "Kids have rights too." Meanwhile, at the police station, Chief Thompson sat in his office, reviewing Miller's personnel file. The stack of complaints on his desk had grown as more people came forward with stories about Officer Miller's aggressive behavior, particularly toward minorities. Each report felt like a personal failure to the chief. These had happened under his watch. His phone buzzed with another message. This one was from the mayor. "Marcus, this is bigger than our town now. National civil rights groups are involved. We need to handle this right." Thompson leaned back in his chair, remembering Sarah's question about Miller learning from this. The answer would affect not just one officer, but an entire department. In another part of town, Officer Miller sat in his kitchen, staring at his empty uniform hanging on the door. His wife had taken their kids to her mother's house, unable to handle the constant phone calls and angry messages. The local newspaper had printed his photo on the front page with the headline, "Officer handcuffs police chief's daughter. A wake-up call for law enforcement." Back at the Thompson house, something unexpected was happening. Sarah, inspired by the support from her friends and neighbors, had started writing in her journal. "Dear Officer Miller," she wrote, "I was scared when you put handcuffs on me, but I'm more scared that you might do this to other kids who don't have a police chief for a dad." The community response continued to grow. The local church organized a prayer vigil. The elementary school principal called an assembly to discuss children's rights and police interactions. Even the ice cream shop where Sarah loved to get chocolate sundaes put up a sign reading, "Stand Against Racial Profiling," in their window. Chief Thompson watched all of this unfold while holding onto Sarah's yellow backpack, still dusty from being dropped on the sidewalk. He knew that his next actions would set a precedent. This wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about changing a system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. As evening fell, Sarah finally smiled for the first time since the incident. Through her bedroom window, she could see dozens of neighbors gathered on their front lawn, holding candles and signs of support. Emma waved from below, holding up a new poster, "Sarah Thompson, brave enough to change things." The incident that had started with one officer's prejudice was transforming into something bigger, a movement for change that began with a 9-year-old girl walking home from the playground. The real question now was, how would the police department respond to this wake-up call? 1 week after the incident, Chief Thompson stood before a packed community center. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The usual monthly police meeting had turned into something much bigger. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. "Today," Thompson began, his voice steady and strong, "we're not just here to talk about what happened to my daughter. We're here to make sure it never happens to anyone else's child." The room fell silent. Even the babies who had been crying seemed to understand the importance of this moment. At the front row sat Sarah, wearing a new purple dress, her hair braided neatly. Next to her were 5 other families whose children had similar experiences with Officer Miller, but who had been too afraid to come forward before. Their stories had been discovered during the investigation, each one more troubling than the last. "Our investigation revealed that Officer Miller had 17 complaints filed against him in the past 2 years. Thompson continued, clicking through slides that showed disturbing patterns. 15 of these involved minority children and teenagers. We failed these families by not seeing the pattern sooner. That changes today." In the back of the room, several police officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They wore their uniforms, but today they didn't feel quite so proud of them. One young officer, fresh from the academy, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to the parents describe their children's fear of the police. Chief Thompson unveiled his new plan: mandatory weekly cultural sensitivity training, body cameras that couldn't be turned off, community oversight committees, and a new youth outreach program. But the biggest announcement came last. Starting next month, every officer will spend 1 week working with local schools, getting to know our children as people, not suspects. The changes didn't stop there. Thompson introduced Ms. Rodriguez, Sarah's neighbor who had recorded the incident, as the head of the new Civilian Review Board. She would lead a team of community members who would review police conduct and have real power to recommend disciplinary action. In the middle of the meeting, something unexpected happened. Sarah stood up and walked to the podium. The room held its breath as Chief Thompson lifted her up to reach the microphone. "I used to want to be a police officer like my daddy," she said, her voice small but clear. "I still do, but now I want to be one who changes things." Her words brought tears to many eyes in the room. Even the toughest officers found themselves swallowing hard. One veteran cop quietly removed his badge and stared at it, as if seeing it for the first time through new eyes. The meeting lasted 3 hours longer than planned. People shared stories, cried together, and most importantly, started making real plans for change. Local business owners offered to sponsor youth programs. Teachers volunteered to help with police training. Parents signed up to join oversight committees. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Miller sat in his empty house, watching the meeting live stream on his laptop. His suspension had turned into termination after the investigation revealed his history of discriminatory behavior. His wife had taken their kids and moved in with her parents, unable to handle the shame and angry phone calls. As the meeting drew to a close, Chief Thompson made one final announcement. Officer Miller's actions weren't just one man's mistake. They were a symptom of a bigger problem. Starting tomorrow, we're reviewing every arrest, made in this department over the past 5 years. We're going to find any other officers who show similar patterns." The room erupted in applause, but Sarah's response captured everyone's attention. She hugged her father tight and said loud enough for the microphone to catch, "Daddy, I think we're finally fixing it." Her words, spoken with such innocent hope, became the headline in next day's paper. Real change was happening in their small town, sparked by one terrible incident with a 9-year-old girl. But everyone in that room knew this was just the beginning. They had a long way to go, but at least now they were heading in the right direction. 3 months passed like a whirlwind of change. The small town of Oakwood Heights had become a national example of police reform, with news crews regularly visiting to document their progress. On a bright Sunday afternoon, the community gathered in the park where Sarah's fateful walk home had begun, but this time for a celebration. Sarah stood on a small stage, wearing her favorite yellow dress, addressing a crowd that included police officers, community members, and even reporters from major networks. Her voice, once silenced by handcuffs, now rang out clear and confident. "When something bad happens," she said, "you can either stay scared or try to make things better. My daddy taught me to always choose making things better." The crowd cheered as she unveiled the sign for the new Youth and Police Partnership Program, which she had helped design. The program paired police officers with local kids for mentoring, sports, and educational activities. Already, 20 officers had signed up, including some who had initially resisted the changes. Chief Thompson watched his daughter with pride, remembering how far they'd come. The department's review had led to 5 more officers being removed for similar patterns of behavior. But more importantly, it had led to healing. New officers were hired with a focus on diversity and community connection. The police station's walls, once bare, now displayed children's artwork and thank you letters. In the audience sat Officer Miller's wife and children. After the initial anger had faded, they had become unexpected allies in the fight for change. Miller's teenage son now spoke at police training sessions, describing how his father's actions had affected their family. "My dad's mistake destroyed our family," he would say, "but it helped fix a broken system." Sarah's influence had spread beyond their town. Her story had inspired police departments across the country to examine their own practices. A children's book about her experience, titled Sarah's Walk Home, was being used in schools to teach kids about their rights and how to interact with law enforcement. The changes weren't just on paper. Real differences could be seen throughout the community. Police officers now regularly visited schools to read stories and play basketball with kids. The weekend farmers market had a police booth where officers served free lemonade and listened to community concerns. The us versus them mentality was slowly dissolving. Mrs. Rodriguez, now heading the successful Civilian Review Board, shared some remarkable statistics. Complaints against officers had dropped by 70% in just 3 months. More importantly, positive interactions between police and minority communities had increased dramatically. And it all started, she said, holding back tears, because one brave little girl walked home from the playground. As for Sarah, she had become something of a local celebrity, but she handled it with grace beyond her years. She still wanted to be a police officer, but now she also wanted to be a teacher, so I can teach police officers how to be nice to kids. Her father had helped her start a junior police academy that focused on community service rather than enforcement. The ceremony concluded with something unexpected. Sarah invited all the children present to join her on stage. Together, they released dozens of yellow balloons into the sky, each carrying a message of hope written by a community member. As the balloons floated away, Sarah spoke one last time. "Officer Miller made a big mistake that day," she said, showing wisdom far beyond her 9 years. "But his mistake helped us all learn something important. Now, when I see a police officer, I don't feel scared anymore. And that's not just because my daddy is the chief. It's because we all work together to make things right." As the crowd dispersed, Chief Thompson hugged his daughter tight. A news reporter asked Sarah what she would say to other communities facing similar challenges. Her answer was simple but profound. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us can help make the best changes for everybody. The story of the police chief's daughter and the officer who arrested her had ended, but its impact continued to ripple outward, changing lives and policies far beyond the borders of their small town. And it all began with one little girl's walk home from the playground.